The microphone hit the desk with a hollow thud that echoed through Studio 6B. Johnny Carson's hand was trembling. The audience, still mid-laugh from his opening monologue, didn't understand what they were seeing. Doc Severinson's trumpet hung silent in the air. Ed McMahon leaned forward from his chair, concern flooding his face. And then, cutting through 30 years of perfectly timed comedy, through thousands of nights of controlled brilliance, came a sound no one in that studio had ever heard before. Johnny Carson was crying. But this wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not on The Tonight Show. Not to the man who had spent 3 decades teaching America how to laugh through everything. Yet there he sat, behind that iconic desk, holding a telephone receiver to his ear, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak. The red light on camera 1 was still glowing. Millions were watching. And for the first time in the history of late-night television, no one knew what to do. How did we get here? How does a man who built an empire on perfect timing lose control in front of the entire country? The answer was traveling through a phone line, in a voice he hadn't heard in weeks, saying words he never thought he'd hear again. To understand what happened that night, you need to know that Johnny Carson never broke character. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. It was a Tuesday in April 1987. Studio 6B at NBC's Burbank facility hummed with its usual pre-show energy. Crew members adjusted lights. Doc Severinson ran through the night's musical cues with the band. The audience, fresh from the California sunshine, settled into their seats with the electric anticipation that came with seeing Johnny Carson live. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would change television history. Backstage, in his dressing room, Johnny sat alone. He wore his usual navy suit, perfectly pressed. His tie was knotted with the precision of someone who had done this 4,531 times before. On his desk sat a stack of cue cards for the monologue, a coffee that had gone cold, and something else, a pink message slip that his assistant had left 2 hours earlier. "Your mother called. Says it's important. We'll try again during show." Johnny stared at that slip of paper. His mother, Ruth Carson, was 78 years old and living in Nebraska. They spoke once a week, usually on Sundays. She never called during show time. Never. In 30 years of broadcasting, she had maintained an almost religious respect for his work schedule. If she was calling now, during the show, something was wrong. He picked up the phone. Put it down. Picked it up again. The stage manager knocked on his door. 5 minutes, Johnny." He left the phone on the desk and walked to the stage. The monologue started perfectly. Johnny delivered his opening jokes with the timing of a Swiss watch. The audience laughed in all the right places. Ed McMahon's famous "Hi-yo" punctuated the rhythm. Everything was going according to the script that had worked for 3 decades. But Johnny's eyes kept drifting to the wings, where he could see a production assistant holding up a phone receiver, mouthing the words, "Your mother. She insists." He finished a joke about Congress. The audience roared. He turned to his desk, ready to transition to the next segment, and that's when he made a decision that no producer would have ever approved. He looked at camera 1, held up his hand to the audience, and said 6 words that stopped the entire production cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me please." The laughter died instantly. The band fell silent. Ed McMahon's smile froze. In the control room, the director's hand hovered over the commercial break button, unsure if this was planned or if they were witnessing a medical emergency. Johnny Carson never broke the show's rhythm. Never stopped mid-flow. Never acknowledged that anything existed outside the carefully constructed world of The Tonight Show. But he was doing it now. He gestured to the production assistant in the wings. She rushed out with the phone, the cord trailing behind her like a lifeline. Johnny took the receiver. The camera stayed on him, uncertain. Should they cut away? Go to commercial? In the control room, the producer made a split-second decision that would define his career: keep rolling. Johnny lifted the phone to his ear. "Mom?" His voice cracked on that single syllable. The audience, still confused, began to understand that something real was happening. This wasn't a bit. This wasn't comedy. This was life intruding on the show in a way that had never happened before. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. For 10 seconds, Johnny just listened. His face, usually so composed, so controlled, began to crumble. His free hand gripped the edge of his desk. His shoulders hunched forward. And then, in front of 15 million viewers, Johnny Carson started to cry. Not gentle tears. Not the mist you see at weddings. Real, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and ancient. The kind of crying you do when the wall you've built for 30 years finally breaks. Ed McMahon stood up from his chair and took a step toward his friend, then stopped, unsure if his presence would help or hurt. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet completely, his usual showman's smile replaced by naked concern. The audience sat in perfect silence, witnessing something they instinctively knew was sacred. Johnny tried to speak into the phone. Failed. Tried again. His voice came out in a whisper that the microphone barely caught. "I love you too, Mom." He listened for another moment, nodded, then slowly placed the receiver back on its cradle. He sat there, behind his desk, hands covering his face, crying in front of the entire country. The red light on the camera never blinked off. The tape kept rolling. History kept recording. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was only 45 seconds, Johnny lowered his hands. His eyes were red. His perfect hair was slightly disheveled where he'd run his fingers through it. He looked directly into camera one, and when he spoke, his voice was different than it had been in 30 years of broadcasting. It was raw. Human. Unguarded. "I'm sorry," he said. "My mother, she just told me something I needed to hear." He paused, gathering himself. "She said she's been diagnosed with cancer? Stage 4. The doctors say she has maybe 3 months." The audience gasped. Someone in the back row began to cry. Johnny continued, his words coming slowly, carefully. "And she called me tonight during the show, because she wanted me to know something. She said, 'Johnny, I've watched you make people laugh for 30 years. You've brought joy into homes all across this country. You've helped people forget their troubles, even if just for an hour. That's a gift. That's a legacy. And I'm so proud of you.'" His voice broke again on the word. "Proud." She said, "Don't you stop now. Don't you let my sickness stop that laughter. Keep doing what you do. That's how you honor me. That's how you love me. By making people smile." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny picked up a cue card from his desk. It was supposed to be for the next joke in his monologue. Instead, he turned it over, grabbed a pen, and began writing. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing his hand moving across the white cardboard. When he finished, he held it up to the camera. On it, in his handwriting, were 6 words. "For Ruth Carson. My hero. My mom." He set the card down on his desk, carefully, as if it were made of glass. Then he looked at the audience, at the camera, at the millions of people watching at home, and he made another choice. "We're going to continue the show," he said. "Because that's what she wants. That's what she called to tell me. That laughter matters. That joy matters. That even in the darkest times, we need these moments of light." He took a breath. Wiped his eyes. Straightened his tie. "So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you jokes. You're going to laugh. And somewhere in Nebraska, my mom is going to watch this, and she's going to smile, and that's going to be the best medicine I could ever give her." The audience began to applaud. Slowly at first, then building into a standing ovation that lasted 2 full minutes. Doc Severinsen raised his trumpet, and the band began to play softly, a gentle, supportive melody that filled the space without overwhelming it. Ed McMahon wiped his own eyes and gave Johnny a small nod that said everything words couldn't. And then Johnny Carson did something remarkable. He picked up his next cue card, looked at camera one, and delivered a joke. His timing was perfect. His delivery was flawless. The audience, still emotional, still processing what they'd witnessed, laughed. Not because the joke was particularly funny, but because they understood what was happening. They were participating in an act of love. They were helping Johnny honor his mother in the only way he knew how. The show went on. And so did the love. Continued for another 40 minutes. Johnny interviewed his scheduled guests. He bantered with Ed. He laughed at Doc's musical jokes. But something had changed. There was a tenderness in his performance, a vulnerability that had never been there before. For the first time in 30 years, America wasn't watching Johnny Carson the performer. They were watching Johnny Carson the man. The son. The human being who loved his mother and was terrified of losing her. When the show ended, Johnny didn't do his usual wave and exit. Instead, he picked up that cue card, the one with his message to his mother, and he held it to his chest. The camera faded to black on that image, America's greatest comedian, clutching a piece of cardboard like it was the most precious thing in the world. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling became the stuff of legend at NBC. Johnny walked off the stage still holding the cue card, and went directly to his dressing room. He closed the door. And for the next hour, he sat alone, the card on his lap, making phone calls. To his mother, to tell her he loved her. To his brothers, to coordinate care. To his own children, to remind them to call their grandmother. The next morning, every major newspaper in America ran the story. Carson breaks down on air. The night Johnny cried. Talk show king shows his heart. But the headlines missed the point. This wasn't about a breakdown. It was about a breakthrough. It was about a man who had spent his entire career maintaining perfect control, choosing the exact right moment to let that control go. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. The Tonight Show's ratings increased. Not because people were tuning in for another emotional moment, but because they felt they finally knew who Johnny Carson really was. Letters poured in from across the country. People sharing their own stories of loss, of cancer, of difficult phone calls with aging parents. Johnny read every single one. He kept them in a box in his dressing room, and on difficult nights, he would read through them, reminded that his vulnerability had given others permission to be vulnerable too. Ruth Carson lived for 6 more months, not 3. Johnny flew to Nebraska every weekend. He sat by her bedside, held her hand, told her jokes. On her final day, in October 1987, he was there. The last thing she said to him was, "Keep making them laugh, Johnny. That's your gift to the world." He did. For 5 more years, Johnny Carson continued hosting The Tonight Show. But something had shifted. His monologues had more heart. His interviews went deeper. He wasn't afraid to show emotion anymore, to let the audience see that beneath the perfectly timed jokes was a man who felt things deeply, who loved fiercely, who understood that laughter and tears weren't opposites. They were partners in the human experience. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. When Johnny Carson retired in 1992, that cue card went with him. He kept it in his home office, framed, on the wall behind his desk. Every late-night host who came after him knew the story. David Letterman, Jay Leno, Conan O'Brien, Jimmy Fallon, they all understood that Johnny had done something that night that changed the format forever. He had shown that late-night television didn't have to be just jokes and celebrity interviews. It could be real. It could be human. It could be a place where emotion was allowed to exist alongside laughter. In 2005, when Johnny Carson passed away, that cue card was found among his most treasured possessions. His family donated it to the Smithsonian, where it now sits in the American History Museum's collection, a small piece of cardboard that represents something much larger, the moment when America's greatest comedian showed us that his real gift wasn't making us laugh, it was making us feel. The night Johnny Carson heard his mother's voice and couldn't finish the show wasn't a failure of professionalism. It was a masterclass in humanity. It was a reminder that the things that break us are often the same things that make us whole. That vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop performing and start being real. The phone call lasted less than 2 minutes. The emotional aftermath lasted 35 years and counting. Because on that Tuesday night in April 1987, 15 million people learned something that changed how they saw not just Johnny Carson, but television itself, and maybe even themselves. Sometimes the most important call you'll ever receive comes at exactly the wrong time. And sometimes answering it, even when the cameras are rolling, even when millions are watching, even when it means breaking every rule of show business, is the only right thing to do. Johnny Carson taught America to laugh. But on that night, he taught us something even more important. He taught us that it's okay to cry. That love is worth interrupting everything for. That your mother's voice, even when she's delivering the worst news imaginable, is still the most beautiful sound in the world.